There is a city in America that sits below the water that surrounds it, not at sea level, below it. Parts of New Orleans, Louisiana are 8 feet beneath the surface of Lake Pontchartrain, which presses against the city's northern edge behind a system of levees and floodwalls and pumping stations that run 24 hours a day, every day, pumping water out of a city that nature keeps trying to fill. The Mississippi River, which built the land New Orleans stands on, runs through the city at a level above the rooftops of the neighborhoods beside it, held in place by levees that have been raised and reinforced for 300 years. The entire city is, in engineering terms, a bowl surrounded by water on 3 sides, sitting on land that is sinking, protected by walls that have failed before and that everyone knows will be tested again. Before August 29, 2005, roughly 455,000 people lived inside that bowl. 40 million tourists visited the city every year. The French Quarter was the most photographed neighborhood in the American South. The music that came out of this city changed the world. And then the levees broke. To understand what New Orleans lost, you have to understand what New Orleans was, and what it was has no equivalent anywhere else in the United States. The city was founded in 1718 by Jean-Baptiste Le Moyne de Bienville, a French-Canadian explorer who chose a crescent-shaped bend in the Mississippi River roughly 100 miles upriver from the Gulf of Mexico. The location was, by any rational measure, terrible. The ground was swamp, mosquitoes carried yellow fever, the river flooded regularly, the nearest solid ground was miles away. Bienville chose the spot because it offered a portage route to Lake Pontchartrain and from there to the Gulf, allowing ships to bypass the treacherous, shifting mouth of the Mississippi. It was a strategic decision, not a livable one. The first settlers built wooden huts on the riverbank and immediately began dying of disease. The French built levees from the beginning, earthen mounds along the riverbank to hold back the annual floods. The first levees were 3 feet high. They were not enough. The floods came anyway. The French rebuilt. The floods came again. This cycle of flooding, levee failure, rebuilding, and flooding again would continue, without interruption, for 3 centuries. What saved New Orleans from being abandoned in its infancy was not engineering, but economics. The location, terrible as it was for living, was perfect for trade. The Mississippi River drained roughly 40% of the continental United States. Every bushel of grain, every bale of cotton, every barrel of whiskey produced in the interior of the continent could be floated downriver on flatboats and keelboats to New Orleans, where it was loaded onto ocean-going ships and sent to Europe, the Caribbean, and beyond. New Orleans became the funnel through which the wealth of the American interior poured into the global market. Whoever controlled New Orleans controlled the commerce of half a continent. The French ceded Louisiana to Spain in 1762. The Spanish held it for nearly 4 decades, during which time they imposed a grid pattern on the city's streets, built the buildings that tourists now call French Quarter architecture, which is actually Spanish colonial architecture, and established the racial and cultural mixing that would define New Orleans more than any other American city. The Code Noir, the French colonial law governing slavery, and its Spanish successors created a social hierarchy unique in North America. Enslaved Africans, free people of color, Creoles of mixed European and African descent, French planters, Spanish administrators, and eventually American frontiersmen all inhabited the same compressed geography, sharing streets, markets, churches, and, crucially, music. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803, in which the United States bought the entire Louisiana Territory from Napoleon for $15 million, roughly 4 cents an acre, transformed New Orleans from a colonial outpost into the most strategically important city in the young republic. Thomas Jefferson had originally sought only the city itself and the port. Napoleon, who needed cash for his European wars and had just lost 50,000 soldiers to yellow fever in Haiti, offered the whole territory. The deal doubled the size of the United States overnight, and New Orleans, the pearl of the purchase, became an American city. The Americans who arrived in New Orleans after the purchase did not blend smoothly with the existing population. The Creole families who had lived there for generations regarded the Anglo-Americans as uncouth, aggressive, and culturally inferior. The Americans regarded the Creoles as decadent, papist, and suspiciously comfortable with racial mixing. The two groups settled on opposite sides of Canal Street, which became the dividing line between the French Quarter, the Creole City, and the Garden District, the American City. This division, cultural, linguistic, and architectural, persisted for decades and gave New Orleans its fundamental character, a city that was always at least two cities at once, layered on top of each other, arguing with each other, and producing from that argument something that neither culture could have created alone. Yellow fever defined life and death in New Orleans for over a century. The mosquitoes that bred in the swamps and standing water surrounding the city carried the virus, and the epidemics that swept through the population were catastrophic in scope. The epidemic of 1853 killed over 8,000 people in a city of roughly 150,000. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. The dead were stacked in the cemeteries, which is why New Orleans buries its dead above ground, in whitewashed tombs and vaults that line the cemetery walls like apartment buildings for the deceased. The water table is so high that a coffin buried in the ground will float back to the surface after a heavy rain. The above-ground tombs, the cities of the dead, became one of the most distinctive features of New Orleans' landscape, and they exist because the city is too wet to bury its dead. The epidemics also shaped the city's demographics in ways that are still visible. Each wave of yellow fever killed newcomers disproportionately, because long-term residents who had survived earlier outbreaks developed immunity. The Irish and German immigrants who arrived in New Orleans in the 1830s and 1840s, fleeing famine and revolution, died in staggering numbers during their first summer. The phrase seasoning was used to describe the process of surviving one's first yellow fever season. Those who survived were considered acclimated. Those who didn't were buried in mass graves. The city's population was in constant flux, with waves of immigration followed by waves of death, creating a churning, polyglot society in which the only thing that distinguished an old resident from a new one was whether they had survived the fever. The antebellum period was New Orleans' economic golden age, built entirely on cotton and slavery. By the 1840s, New Orleans was the fourth largest city in the United States and the wealthiest per capita. The cotton trade funneled through the port was worth billions in today's dollars. The slave markets on Chartres Street and along the riverfront were the largest in the American South. More enslaved people were bought and sold in New Orleans than in any other city in the country. The auctions took place in the lobbies of hotels, in dedicated exchange buildings, and, notoriously, in the rotunda of the St. Louis Hotel, where enslaved men, women, and children were displayed on raised platforms and sold to the highest bidder while the buyers sipped champagne. The wealth generated by this system built the Garden District, the grandest residential neighborhood in the American South. Greek Revival mansions with two-story columns, wrought iron galleries, and gardens of magnolias and azaleas lined St. Charles Avenue. The streetcar that still runs along St. Charles, the oldest continuously operating street railway in the world, passed these houses on its way from Canal Street to Carrollton, carrying passengers through a canopy of live oaks so thick that the sunlight reached the ground only in scattered coins. The beauty was real. The source of the beauty was slavery. New Orleans has never fully reconciled these two facts, and the tension between them runs through the city's history like a crack in a foundation. The Civil War ended the cotton economy, and the decades that followed were a long, slow decline. The railroads bypassed New Orleans, the river trade diminished. The city, which had been the commercial capital of the South, became a regional backwater, losing economic ground to Houston, Atlanta, and Dallas. But what New Orleans lost in commerce, it retained in culture. The city's unique blend of French, Spanish, African, Creole, Cajun, Caribbean, and American traditions had produced something that no amount of economic decline could replicate elsewhere. The thing they created, the thing that made New Orleans unlike any other place in the world, was the music. Jazz did not emerge from a conservatory. It emerged from the streets, the funeral processions, the dance halls, and, most critically, from a neighborhood called Storyville. Storyville was the city's legalized red light district, established in 1897 by Alderman Sidney Story, who gave his name to the neighborhood over his strenuous objections. From 1897 to 1917, when the United States Navy ordered it shut down because it was demoralizing the sailors at the nearby naval station, Storyville was the place where New Orleans' musical traditions converged. Ragtime pianists played in the parlors of the fancier establishments. Brass bands marched the streets for funerals and festivals, playing hymns on the way to the cemetery and syncopated dance music on the way back. In the clubs and dance halls along Basin Street, musicians blended ragtime, blues, gospel, and the rhythmic traditions of West Africa into something no one had a name for yet. They would call it jazz. The names that came out of this neighborhood and this city constitute the foundation of American popular music. Buddy Bolden, whose cornet was said to be audible for miles, is often cited as the first jazz musician, though no recordings of him survive. King Oliver, whose Creole jazz band set the template for ensemble jazz. Sidney Bechet, whose soprano saxophone playing influenced musicians worldwide. And Louis Armstrong, born in 1901 in a neighborhood so poor and violent it was called the battlefield, raised in a home for wayward boys where he learned to play the cornet, and eventually became the most important musician of the 20th century. Armstrong left New Orleans for Chicago in 1922 and never returned to live there permanently. He would say later that New Orleans had given him everything: the music, the feel, the joy. But New Orleans had also given him Jim Crow, poverty, and the boys' home where he'd been sent at age 11 for firing a pistol into the air on New Year's Eve. The city that created him was also the city he had to leave to become himself. That tension between what New Orleans gives its people and what it takes from them has never been resolved. The jazz funeral tradition, perhaps the city's most iconic cultural practice, embodies this tension in physical form. When a musician dies in New Orleans, a brass band leads the funeral procession through the streets. The walk to the cemetery is played in a slow, mournful dirge, the instruments crying out in grief. But after the burial, the music shifts. The snare drum hits a sharp crack, the trumpet lifts into a bright, syncopated melody, and the second line, the crowd of mourners and neighbors and strangers who have joined the procession, begins to dance. The music says two things at once. We are broken by this loss, and we will live anyway. It is the most honest thing New Orleans has ever produced, more honest than the tourism brochures, more honest than the politics, more honest than the food reviews. Death and joy, simultaneously in the same street to the same music. No other American city has a tradition that does this, because no other American city needed one this badly. His departure was part of a larger pattern, the Great Migration, during which millions of black Southerners moved north, taking their music with them. Jazz went to Chicago, to New York, to Kansas City, and to the world. New Orleans kept the tradition alive, but the center of gravity shifted. What New Orleans retained, and what no other city could replicate, was the culture that had produced the music. The second-line parades, in which brass bands led dancers through the streets in celebrations of life and death. The Mardi Gras Indians, African-American social clubs that spent months sewing elaborate hand-beaded suits and marched through their neighborhoods on Mardi Gras Day in displays of craft and pride that had nothing to do with the tourist parades on Canal Street. The food, which was not restaurant food but home food, gumbo and red beans and rice and crawfish boil and po' boys, cooked in kitchens by people who had learned from their mothers, who had learned from their grandmothers, recipes that blended French technique, Spanish ingredients, West African spices, and Choctaw herbs into a cuisine that could not be separated from the specific geography that produced it. This culture was not a performance, it was a way of living. And it was sustained by the neighborhoods, by the physical proximity of the people who carried it. The Treme, the oldest African-American neighborhood in the United States, sat just north of the French Quarter. The 7th Ward, the traditional Creole neighborhood. The 9th Ward, working class and predominantly black. The Irish Channel, originally populated by Irish immigrants who dug the canals that drained the swamps. These neighborhoods were poor by national standards, their houses were small and often in disrepair, and the city services they received were consistently inadequate. But they were intact communities with deep roots, multi-generational relationships, and cultural traditions that could not be transplanted. The tourism industry discovered New Orleans gradually and then all at once. Mardi Gras had always drawn visitors, but through the mid-20th century it was primarily a local celebration. The tourist version, the one with corporate-sponsored floats, televised parades, and beads thrown to drunken strangers on Bourbon Street, was a later invention. The 1984 World's Fair, held on the New Orleans riverfront, was intended to launch the city as a major tourist destination. It was a financial disaster, losing over $100 million and leaving behind a half-empty development site that took decades to fill. But it planted the seed. The convention center expanded, hotels were built. The Superdome, already the largest enclosed stadium in the world, hosted Super Bowls and Final Fours. The French Quarter, which had been a residential neighborhood of antique shops, jazz clubs, and Creole cottages, began its transformation into a round-the-clock entertainment zone. Bourbon Street became the symbol of what tourism did to New Orleans. Originally a residential street in the heart of the French Quarter, Bourbon Street by the 1990s was a neon-lit gauntlet of bars, strip clubs, daiquiri shops, and souvenir stores selling beads, voodoo dolls, and T-shirts with jokes too crude to repeat. The music that drifted from the clubs was usually cover bands playing classic rock, not jazz. The drinks were fluorescent slushies served in plastic cups shaped like grenades. The tourists stumbled between the bars, drinks in hand, because New Orleans' open container laws allowed it, and the atmosphere on a Saturday night was somewhere between a carnival and a catastrophe. Bourbon Street generated enormous revenue for the city. It also generated a version of New Orleans that had almost nothing to do with the city's actual culture, a cartoon version, Disneyland with alcohol, that locals avoided with a contempt that bordered on hatred. The transformation of Bourbon Street from a residential street into the French Quarter's commercial spine happened gradually, then completely. In the 1940s and 1950s, the street still had residents, families who lived above the shops and listened to actual jazz drifting from the clubs. By the 1970s, the live music had largely given way to recorded music and cover bands. By the 1990s, Bourbon Street had become what it is today, a designated entertainment zone where the primary activities are drinking, eating, drinking more, and purchasing novelty items that reference drinking. The joke among locals is that Bourbon Street is the most popular street in America that no one from the city would voluntarily walk down. This is only slightly an exaggeration. The strip clubs, which proliferated along the 300 and 400 blocks, generated regular controversies over licensing, underage performers, and connections to organized crime. The noise ordinance violations were constant and rarely enforced. The smell, a combination of stale beer, urine, and the sweet rot of garbage left too long in subtropical heat, was Bourbon Street's most honest ambassador. And yet, the money was real. The entertainment district generated hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue annually. The hotels surrounding the French Quarter paid occupancy taxes that funded the city's convention bureau. The restaurants, many of which were genuinely world-class, the Commander's Palace, the Galatoire's, the Antoine's, operated in the same city blocks as the daiquiri shops and achieved a level of culinary excellence that no other American city outside New York could match. This was the paradox of tourism New Orleans. The experience it sold to the mass market was a degraded version of the culture, but the culture itself, the real version, was still there, operating in the background, available to anyone who knew where to look and was willing to leave Bourbon Street. The problem was that the real culture depended on the real people, and the real people depended on affordable housing, stable employment, functional schools, and a city government that provided basic services. New Orleans provided none of these reliably. Meanwhile, the real New Orleans, the New Orleans of the neighborhoods, was struggling with problems that the tourism brochures never mentioned. The murder rate was among the highest in the country. In the early 1990s, New Orleans had a homicide rate that exceeded most American cities by a factor of 2 or 3. The police department was riddled with corruption so deep that officers were implicated not just in accepting bribes, but in committing murders. The public school system was one of the worst performing in the nation. Infrastructure was crumbling. The pumping stations that kept the city dry were aging and underfunded. The levee system, maintained by a patchwork of local levee boards with overlapping jurisdictions, limited budgets, and political priorities that did not always align with engineering necessities, was in a condition that experts had been warning about for decades. In 2001, the Houston Chronicle published a series of articles identifying the destruction of New Orleans by a major hurricane as one of the three most likely catastrophic disasters facing the United States, alongside a terrorist attack on New York City and an earthquake in San Francisco. The first two happened within 4 years. On the morning of August 29, 2005, Hurricane Katrina made landfall on the Gulf Coast as a Category 3 storm. The hurricane itself, while powerful, was not the worst-case scenario that forecasters had feared. The storm surge that it pushed up the shipping channels and into Lake Pontchartrain was. The levees and floodwalls that surrounded New Orleans were designed to withstand a Category 3 hurricane. They failed anyway. The failures were not acts of God. They were acts of engineering incompetence, construction shortcuts, and decades of deferred maintenance. The industrial canal floodwall was breached when the steel sheet piling, driven into soil that was softer than the design specifications had assumed, gave way under the pressure of the surge. The 17th Street Canal floodwall failed in a similar manner. The London Avenue Canal breached in 2 places. Water poured into the city from multiple directions simultaneously. Within hours, roughly 80% of New Orleans was underwater. In some neighborhoods, the water reached the rooftops. People who had not evacuated, many of them elderly, disabled, or without transportation, were trapped in their attics, on their roofs, or in the Superdome, where an estimated 20,000 people sheltered in conditions that deteriorated rapidly as the power failed, the plumbing backed up, and the temperature inside the enclosed stadium climbed above 100 degrees. The convention center, which had not been designated as an official shelter, became one anyway, as roughly 19,000 people arrived seeking refuge and found no food, no water, no medical care, and no security. Reports of violence inside the convention center, some verified, some exaggerated by a media that was itself struggling to understand the scale of the disaster, dominated the national news coverage. What was not exaggerated was the suffering. Elderly people died in their wheelchairs, diabetics went without insulin, infants went without formula. The most powerful country on earth was watching its own citizens die in conditions that would have been condemned in a developing nation. Television cameras broadcast images of American citizens standing on rooftops holding signs that read, "Help," of bodies floating in floodwater, of a modern American city that looked like a war zone. The federal response was catastrophically slow. FEMA, the agency responsible for disaster response, was led by a political appointee with no emergency management experience. The National Guard arrived days late. Supplies that had been pre-positioned outside the city could not be delivered because the roads were flooded. The death toll in Louisiana reached over 1,500 people. The actual number may be higher because some bodies were never recovered and some deaths were never attributed to the storm. The demographics of who died and who survived were not random. The neighborhoods that flooded the deepest were the lowest lying, which were disproportionately poor and disproportionately black. The lower Ninth Ward, a working-class black neighborhood east of the Industrial Canal, was virtually destroyed. The water there reached the eaves. Houses were lifted off their foundations and deposited blocks from where they had stood. The Broadmoor neighborhood, the Gentilly neighborhood, New Orleans East, all flooded. The French Quarter, built on the natural levee of the Mississippi, the highest ground in the city, was barely touched. The Garden District, also on high ground, sustained wind damage but no significant flooding. The geographic divide that had separated rich from poor, white from black, tourist from resident, was mapped precisely onto the flood line. The people who had the least lost the most. The diaspora that followed Katrina scattered New Orleans' population across the country. In the weeks after the storm, roughly 400,000 people, nearly the entire population of the city, were displaced. Many went to Houston, which absorbed over 100,000 evacuees. Others went to Atlanta, Dallas, Memphis, and cities across the South. Some went further. New Orleanians ended up in Utah, Oregon, Minnesota, places that had no cultural connection to the city they had left. The floodwater sat in the city for weeks. In the lower Ninth Ward and parts of New Orleans East, the water did not fully recede for over 3 weeks. When it finally drained, what it left behind was a landscape that resembled a post-apocalyptic film set. Cars were stacked on top of each other where the current had deposited them. Refrigerators, their contents rotted in the August heat, sat on front lawns where homeowners had dragged them out, their doors taped shut, messages scrawled on their sides in spray paint. "Do not open, you will die." The smell was indescribable. It was the smell of everything organic in a subtropical city decomposing simultaneously. Food, plants, wood, drywall, insulation, and in some cases the bodies of people and animals that had not been found. The mold was everywhere, black mold climbing the walls of houses that had stood in water for weeks, rendering them uninhabitable even if the structure was intact. Entire neighborhoods were condemned. The spray-painted markings of the urban search and rescue teams, X's with notations indicating the date, the team, the hazards found, and the number of bodies recovered, became the most recognizable symbol of post-Katrina New Orleans, a grim taxonomy of disaster painted on the front of every house. The question of who came back and who didn't reshaped New Orleans permanently. Before Katrina, New Orleans had a population of roughly 455,000, of whom about 67% were black. By 2010, the population had dropped to 343,829. By 2020, it had partially recovered to 383,997, but the racial composition had shifted. The black population, which had been the cultural backbone of the city's neighborhoods, its music, its food, its traditions, had declined from 67% to roughly 59%. The neighborhoods that did not come back were overwhelmingly the poor black neighborhoods that had flooded the deepest. The lower Ninth Ward, which had been a community of roughly 14,000 people, mostly homeowners, many of them elderly, lost more than 3/4 of its population. A decade after the storm, vast stretches of the lower Ninth remained empty lots, the foundations of vanished houses visible as concrete slabs in the overgrown grass. What came back instead was a different New Orleans. The city that rebuilt was wealthier, whiter, and more focused on tourism than the city that had drowned. The rebuilding money, both federal and private, flowed disproportionately to the neighborhoods that had the political connections and the financial resources to navigate the labyrinthine recovery process. The French Quarter was cleaned up quickly. The warehouse district boomed with new hotels and restaurants. The Marigny and Bywater neighborhoods, which had been affordable enclaves for musicians and artists, were gentrified by newcomers who arrived after the storm, drawn by cheap real estate and the romantic idea of rebuilding a great American city. The newcomers were, in many cases, well-intentioned. They opened restaurants, started nonprofits, and invested in the city's recovery. But they were not the same people who had lived there before, and the culture they brought was not the same culture that had made New Orleans what it was. The second-line parades continued, but the musicians who led them were increasingly supplemented by performers who had learned the tradition in college rather than in the streets. The Mardi Gras Indian suits were still sewn, but some of the master beaters had died or moved away. The food was still extraordinary, but the new restaurants were as likely to serve farm-to-table brunch as gumbo, and the prices had risen to levels that the working-class families who had invented the cuisine could not afford. Airbnb accelerated the transformation. Short-term rental platforms allowed property owners to convert residential housing into de facto hotel rooms, and in a city where tourism was the dominant industry, the financial incentive was overwhelming. A house in the Tremé or the Marigny that might rent to a local family for $1,200 a month could generate $3,000 or more per month as a short-term rental. Entire blocks that had been residential neighborhoods became tourist accommodations. The permanent residents who remained found themselves living in a city that was increasingly designed for visitors rather than for them. The noise, the trash, the strangers in and out at all hours, the loss of neighbors who had been replaced by rotating groups of tourists, all of it contributed to a feeling that the city had been sold out from under the people who had made it worth visiting in the first place. The crime never went away. In the years after Katrina, New Orleans' murder rate, which had been terrible before the storm, remained among the highest in the nation. In some years, it was the highest. The reasons were structural: poverty, inequality, a gutted public school system that had been replaced by a network of charter schools of wildly varying quality, a police department that was still recovering from its own history of corruption and had been placed under a federal consent decree, and the deep trauma of a population that had experienced a collective catastrophe from which many individuals never recovered. The intersection of tourism and violence produced a cognitive dissonance that was uniquely New Orleans. Tourists drinking daiquiris on Bourbon Street, while a mile away in Central City or the 7th Ward, the murder rate rivaled that of some war zones. The insurance crisis delivered the final blow to whatever remained of New Orleans' pretense that the pre-Katrina city might be reassembled. Louisiana's insurance market, which had been fragile before the storm, collapsed in its aftermath. Major insurers withdrew from the state entirely, unwilling to underwrite properties in a city that had demonstrated, conclusively, that it could flood at a catastrophic scale. The state-run insurer of last resort, Louisiana Citizens Property Insurance, absorbed policies that no private company would touch, but its premiums were high and its coverage was limited. Homeowners who had rebuilt after Katrina, many of them using federally subsidized loans, found themselves unable to afford the insurance required to maintain those loans. The National Flood Insurance Program, which had paid out billions in Katrina claims and was billions of dollars in debt as a result, raised its rates. Properties that had been classified as moderate risk were reclassified as high risk. Properties that had been high risk became uninsurable at any price the homeowner could pay. The wetland loss deserves its own accounting because it is the slow-motion catastrophe that may ultimately determine whether New Orleans can exist at all. The Mississippi River Delta, the vast expanse of marsh, swamp, and bayou that surrounds New Orleans to the south and east, was built over thousands of years by the river's seasonal floods, which deposited sediment across the coastal plain, building new land as fast as the Gulf eroded it. The levee system, by confining the river to its channel and preventing the floods that had sustained the delta, cut off the sediment supply. The wetlands began to starve. Meanwhile, the oil and gas industry, which had operated in the Louisiana marshes since the 1930s, cut thousands of miles of canals through the wetlands to access drilling sites and lay pipelines. The canals allowed salt water from the Gulf to intrude into freshwater marshes, killing the vegetation that held the soil together. The land dissolved. Since the 1930s, Louisiana has lost roughly 2,000 square miles of coastal wetland, an area the size of Delaware. The rate of loss has been roughly a football field every 100 minutes, a statistic so often repeated that it has become a cliché, but no less alarming for its familiarity. The wetlands were not just ecosystem, they were infrastructure. Coastal marshes absorb storm surge, each mile of wetland reducing surge height by roughly 1 inch. The wetlands that once stood between New Orleans and the Gulf served the same function as a seawall, slowing and absorbing the water before it reached the levees. As the wetlands disappeared, the levees became the first line of defense rather than the last. The city's margin for error, never large, was shrinking. The Road Home program, the federal recovery initiative established after Katrina to help homeowners rebuild, distributed over $9 billion in grants. But the program was plagued by bureaucratic delays, processing backlogs, and formula disputes that shortchanged owners of lower-valued homes, which were disproportionately owned by Black families. Some applicants waited years for their grants. By the time the money arrived, many had already relocated permanently, rebuilt on their own, or simply given up. The program helped those it reached, but it reached too few, too slowly, and the gap between what was promised and what was delivered became another source of bitterness in a city that had too many already. The result was a city in which the cost of staying was rising faster than the incomes of the people who lived there, while the cost of leaving was measured not in dollars, but in the abandonment of everything that had made the city home. For the musicians who played on Frenchman Street, For the cooks who worked in the restaurant kitchens, for the teachers and the nurses and the bus drivers, New Orleans was not a destination. It was the only place that had ever made sense to them, and it was pricing them out. The politics of recovery were brutal and revealing. The Bring New Orleans Back Commission, appointed by Mayor Ray Nagin, initially proposed a plan that would have converted some of the most heavily damaged neighborhoods, including parts of the lower Ninth Ward and New Orleans East, into green space, acknowledging that rebuilding in areas that had flooded 8 or 10 feet deep was environmentally and financially unsustainable. The reaction from the affected neighborhoods, which were overwhelmingly black, was furious. The plan was seen as an attempt to use the storm as an excuse to permanently displace poor and black communities from valuable land. The green space plan was shelved. The city adopted a policy of allowing residents to rebuild wherever they chose, regardless of flood risk, provided they elevated their homes to the new flood map's base flood elevation. The result was that some families rebuilt in neighborhoods where few of their neighbors returned, isolated houses on empty blocks, their foundations raised 10 or 12 feet on concrete pilings, standing above the empty lots like watchtowers in an abandoned city. New Orleans today draws roughly 18 million visitors per year, a number that has recovered to near pre-Katrina levels. The French Quarter is immaculate. The streetcars run, the restaurants are booked. The jazz clubs on Frenchmen Street are standing room only on weekend nights. The city has poured billions into a rebuilt levee system, the hurricane and storm damage risk reduction system, designed to withstand a storm surge beyond what Katrina produced. The Army Corps of Engineers, the same agency whose designs had failed in 2005, engineered and built the new system at a cost of roughly $14.5 billion. It is, by engineering standards, impressive. Whether it will hold when the next major hurricane arrives is a question that no one can answer with certainty, because the conditions are not the same as they were in 2005. The land is sinking faster. The sea level is higher. The wetlands that once served as a natural buffer between the Gulf and the city, absorbing storm surge before it reached the levees, have been disappearing at a rate of roughly a football field every 100 minutes, consumed by erosion, subsidence, and the canals that the oil and gas industry cut through them for decades. Stand on the levee at the edge of the lower Ninth Ward and look east. The Industrial Canal, the one whose floodwall broke on August 29, 2005, and sent a wall of water into the neighborhood, is directly below you. On the other side, the neighborhood stretches toward the horizon, but what you see is not a neighborhood. It is an absence. Empty lots, overgrown and green, interspersed with the occasional house, some rebuilt, some not, some occupied, some clearly abandoned. The streets are there. The sidewalks are there. The fire hydrants are there. But the people, the houses, the churches, the corner stores, the fabric of the community that had lived here for generations are mostly gone. In the silence, you can hear what New Orleans lost, and it is not the buildings. The buildings can be rebuilt. What was lost was the network of relationships, the multi-generational proximity, the grandmother living on the same block as the grandchildren, the musician who played at the corner bar every Thursday, the cook who knew what everyone on the street liked for dinner. That network cannot be rebuilt because the people who constituted it were scattered, and time, as it does, moved on without them. The tourists on Bourbon Street do not see the lower Ninth Ward. They do not see Gentilly or New Orleans East or the empty blocks in Central City. They see the French Quarter, the Garden District, the Marigny, the curated and renovated version of New Orleans that was designed to be seen. And what they see is genuinely wonderful. The architecture is extraordinary. The food is among the best in the world. The music is alive, even if the musicians are struggling. The live oaks draped in Spanish moss along St. Charles Avenue are as beautiful as any urban landscape in America. New Orleans, even diminished, even hollowed out, even pricing out the people who made it what it is, remains one of the most extraordinary cities on earth. But the sparkling is borrowed now. The levees hold the water back. The pumps run all night. The land sinks a little more each year. The insurance bills arrive. The tourists come and the tourists go, and the money they bring sustains the restaurants and the hotels and the clubs, but it does not sustain the neighborhoods, because the neighborhoods were never the product the tourists came to buy. The tourists came to buy the experience of New Orleans, and the experience of New Orleans was produced by the people of New Orleans. And the people of New Orleans are leaving because they cannot afford to stay. Laissez les bons temps rouler. Let the good times roll. It was always the city's motto, its invitation, its promise. The good times are still rolling on Bourbon Street, on Frenchmen Street, in the convention center and the Superdome and the restaurants where you can eat a meal that will rearrange your understanding of what food can be. But the good times now are a show, performed for an audience that pays well, by a cast that is shrinking. The musicians play, the beads fly, the drinks are strong and the nights are long, and the city glitters in the subtropical dark like something precious and precarious, which is exactly what it is. Somewhere in the lower 9th Ward, a concrete slab sits in a lot full of tall grass. It was the foundation of someone's house. It has been there for 20 years. No one has built on it. No one has removed it. It just sits, level and gray, marking the spot where something was, and where something is not, and where the grass keeps growing, and the water keeps rising, and New Orleans keeps being New Orleans, which has always meant being beautiful and broken at the same time.